Hi everyone, and welcome to the second Flip Collab for teaching literacy this teaching period. My name's Rachel, and this is for one of the two options that we have for our assessments, this TP. So this is for planning for diverse learners. If you're after the folio, there is another Flip Collaborator about that, so just have a look in the Padlet and you'll find the link there if you're after the folio. So this one is all about diverse learners and being able to cater and differentiate for all of the diverse needs and learners just within a typical classroom, as you can see with my little cartoon there. So let's get started. My first slide is just an overview to break it down and remember some of the key things that we need to remember. So we are doing our essay or report or whatever we would like to call it. Catering for diverse learners is a 1,000 word limit. The weighting is worth 30% and it is due in week 9, which is Monday the 14th of January. As I said in the other collab, I know it seems far away, but we like to get out the information nice and early so you can have a think about it over the break if you want to start researching and making a start. So basically I've taken some of the key things from the assessment details. So you'll notice in the assessment details that there's 7 key things that need to be included. I went through those because I find they're a little bit more specific than things in the rubric itself. The rubric is basically broken up into your knowledge of pedagogical practices within literacy, which is 30%, and then your ability to cater for diverse learning needs is also worth 30%. And then your ability to connect with inclusion methods is also worth 30%. So I found that those 7 key points that they made in the assessment details were really helpful in actually thinking, well, what exactly do I need to include? So I've taken those 7 things and made slides about each one and just sort of given some advice about things, maybe the approach that I would take, some ideas that I can give you. It's definitely not an exhaustive list by all means, and when we have the interactive collab we can brainstorm and get some further ideas. They're just things that I have thought of to help get you started. Now please, as we said with the last one, these assessments are brand new and new information comes to light, or I might have forgotten something or didn't include something, so please keep listening out for information and come to the interactive collab or listen to the recording so you can have like up-to-date information. So basically we have 3 students and we need to focus on 2 of them. So you'll be choosing 2 of Simon, Hanin or Tegan, and each of them have very different needs, all typical to a normal everyday classroom that we'll all be dealing with as teachers. I'm not going to read them all, but there's key things to do with Simon. So we've got Simon who's working above his expected grade level. In the beginning of the scenario, they talk about the fact that it's a grade 4 classroom, sort of mid to high socioeconomic status, quite a big school with about 600 kids, I think it said, and these are typical grade 4s. Simon's actually a high achiever. He's working at a grade 6 level. He comprehends really well, reads really well, works well with the teacher and is able to infer, make connections, use clues in the text to form opinions, justify his answers. Writing is also really strong. And we've got Hanin as well. She's an ESL student. She's of Arabic descent but was born in Australia. All really key information. Her parents are very supportive, but obviously with different, English being a second language at home, they might find it difficult to help with some of the things that maybe the teacher has asked her to do. And she finds it difficult to understand some language concepts and some text features, particularly when it's culturally specific. Your assessment data shows that she's 6 months behind where she should be with her reading and her writing. We've got Tegan. She's struggling with both reading and writing. Her probe test, which is a reading comprehension test, shows that she's decoding pretty well, so don't need to worry about any decoding strategies, but she is finding it tricky to comprehend things beyond a literal understanding. So when you do a probe test, there's all sorts of different comprehension questions that are asked. So she wasn't able to reorganize and she wasn't able to infer and look for clues within the text. With her writing, generally structured okay, punctuation's okay, but there's a bit of a lack of depth in terms of storyline and plot, and sort of probably more to do with narrative structure and sort of critical thinking and depth of thought, I would say, with some of her writing. So overall, we're going to start off our piece with just an overview of what we've found about the student. It doesn't mean that you need to rewrite the whole thing, but just give us an idea on what's happening with that particular child. So we're just identifying two of the students and talking about some of the key features with them. We need to identify the area of diversity for those students. So each of those three students have different needs. Now we don't need to do all three. So I have all three on my slides because obviously I want to pass on information to you guys, but you will only need to focus on two. So you might focus on Simon and Hanin, or Simon and Tegan, Hanin and Tegan, just two of them. So just remember that I'm always going to talk about all three of them, but you only need to focus on two. So when we talk about an area of diversity for those students, we can see that within what we've already know about those three students are all quite different. So we've got Simon, who's working above the expected grade level, and I feel like the issues are going to be for him is that he needs to be challenged and he needs to be engaged, because with students who are working above and maybe perhaps so far above, there's always a risk of them, I suppose, being bored and not challenged and therefore not progressing. So we always need to remember with the high-flying kids that every kid has that value added and every kid needs to progress that 12 months within a 12-month framework so that everybody is seeing growth, I suppose, is what we're trying to say. So an area of need or diversity or point of need for him would be that we need to still have him pushing along and still achieving at the rate that he has been, because we don't want him to be just sort of stall, I guess. So they're the sorts of issues that I'm finding it would be happening with Simon in the classroom. So with Hanin, I suppose the issues or points of need for her would be, I suppose, that she's working below the grade level, so that's something that we'd need to think about. Her area of diversity is going to be the fact that there are cultural issues there. So if she has learnt language, perhaps in her first language, how that language could be different structurally and how it's written to English, so there could be misconceptions about how English is structured and how to write those certain things. And there just could be a lot of concepts and things that are culturally specific. So, you know, she just might not have the experience and the exposure to be able to make connections to those things that are just quite foreign to her. I know in Tim's podcast, you know, he makes those connections to like a cricket game and how, you know, if you don't know those cricket terms, it just doesn't mean anything to you. So same could be for him in the classroom, that, you know, you might read a story and it could be about, you know, going to a carnival, and if she doesn't know what a carnival is or she's never been to one, then it doesn't make any sort of, it doesn't hit home with her in any way. So you need to think about how cultural factors could be influencing her level of achievement. You could also maybe identify the fact that there's going to be limited help from home as well, and that's going to be one of her areas of diversity as well. With Tegan, she's working below the expected grade level, so I suppose it's sort of the opposite spectrum to Simon, and then you have the opposite sort of challenges and things happen with Tegan where, you know, it's great getting to grade 4 level. I'm sure Tegan would be very well aware that she is not perhaps performing as well as some others, so there can be some sort of self-esteem issues. There could be disengagement from what she needs to do in the classroom. Obviously, there's a lot of comprehension issues that need to be worked on within the classroom. So there are some of the issues and some of the points of need and areas of diversity that the students, each of those students would be, I suppose, need to focus on if they were real students in our classroom. So what pedagogical practices would you use to engage these learners? So we know what the issues are with the learners now. We know what potential things could be happening with them, what things could happen next if we don't intervene and start doing something about and making sure that each of these students are progressing with their learning. So I had to think about Simon, and you think about how, you know, you have to look at I suppose some of the things from perhaps the grade 5 and the grade 6 curriculum could help you to make some decisions about where you need to go with Simon. So if he's working at a level that's 2 years above where he should be completing those outcomes at that particular level. So he needs to have things that are really engaging and really challenging to make him progress further. So I was thinking to myself, what things would be good for Simon? Things like literature circles, things like reciprocal reading. Both had that same element of critical thought and critical analysis, independent learning, students running their own. It moves beyond guided reading and moves into the stage where students run their own session, scaffolded by the teacher. It really does need a higher level of thought and analysis and being able to interpret text, have some sort of opinion, work to the next step of sort of justifying. It's almost like debating with others and challenging ideas. So that sort of higher level of, you know, moved beyond shared, moved beyond guided. He really needs to be doing some sort of reciprocal reading type scenario when he's working with the teacher. He also could be doing some element of independent reading himself, but I would be encouraging him to choose challenging texts. So I know that a lot of the time they say that, you know, just right texts are good for independent reading. I was doing, funnily enough, some research the other day at school when we were looking at the ideas behind independent reading and how, you know, if students read 100 just right books, they only progress so many reading levels, but if they read 50 challenging books, they actually made more progress than the students who read just right books. So someone like him would need to be pushed to read harder, challenging texts to push him to the next level with his independent reading. I would want to see Simon doing lots of collaboration and lots of discussion, because that's the stage that he's up to, where he needs to be working in a group with like-minded students who could debate ideas and sort of get that higher level of analysis, and then they can dig deeper into higher levels of text. You know, they're doing things like analysis and questioning and doing some evaluation, all of those higher level thinking skills. On the opposite end, we've got Tegan over here, and she really needs quite the opposite of that. So I would be encouraging Tegan to have lots of repeated readings of the same texts so that she can get repeated exposures to text. She doesn't have issues with decoding, so it's not a question of fluency with reading, but just more a bit of time to process ideas and what's happening and reflect and sort of get some of those thinking skills going. She could do lots of, she'd need lots of shared reading and modelled of specific skills. So that would involve the teacher breaking skills down and modelling them for her in some sort of shared reading experience, perhaps. Perhaps maybe a buddy reading or some sort of mentoring could help her, as well as some visual thinking skills, perhaps. And we've got Hennin in the middle, and you can probably see with my three little examples, they might look sort of cross over a bit, because there could be sort of pedagogical practices that could match quite a few different students, which is why they get used obviously so widely. So Hennin, I'd love to see her doing lots of collaboration, because the best way to learn is to learn from others, and to have that ability to chat and talk and discuss and sort of get ideas out will help her to see, I suppose, how it's done academically, but also exposure, like other kids could explain when I went to this and this happened, and give her some of that background knowledge and experience that perhaps she's missing out on. I'd like to see exposure to multiple texts, many different types of texts. She needs exposure to not just novels, but non-fiction, magazines. You'd want to see her reading really widely. You'd want to have guided reading sessions with her with multiple focuses on using, I suppose, quite considered texts and thinking about some of those cultural factors when choosing texts, and exposure to lots of different sort of texts. So there might be a text about camping, or there might be a text about going to the beach, and there might be a text just to give her lots of exposure to different types of things that maybe she hasn't done herself. Again, you could use shared reading with modelling. It'd be great to give her lots of feedback at different stages in the lesson, as well as, of course, independent reading could be used for all three, just might have a different focus, where Hanin's focus for the independent reading is multiple exposures to different kinds of genres and text to widen her knowledge, I suppose, whereas Simon's focus is on challenging texts. So that's just a rundown on some things that I just thought of off the top of my head, of things that could be good for pedagogical practices, which could be good for each one. I've tried to make them literacy specific, but there also could be things, like collaboration, for example. That's just a general thing, but it suits the needs of the child that we're talking about. So what inclusion methods could be used to engage these students? Now, if you've had a listen to the other A1B folio collab, I also spoke about the fact that in week 6, they talk quite in depth about the fact that obviously in every single classroom, students are all different, and you need to engage them at their point of need, and you need to ensure that all of your lessons are differentiated to involve the Simons and the Tegans and the Hanins in your classroom. So how are you going to be able to do that? So there was a great video in there where I think it was a professor was talking about, I think it linked to the Literacy Toolkit, which is an absolutely excellent resource, and it talks a lot about guided reading, it talks a lot about shared reading, independent reading, it even talks about the 4 resources model, so it's a great resource. Definitely have a look when you're doing this. So she talks about multiple pathways. What she meant by that was the fact that, if you want to get students from A to B, you need to have multiple ways for them to get there. They shouldn't all be following the same path. So you need to have a variety of ways and a variety of choices on how students are going to achieve the learning intention or get to where they need to get to. So it shouldn't all just be one way. I suppose it's moving away from that one size fits all. It's moving away from there's this one right way to do things, and the one right way is to fill in this worksheet. There has to be multiple ways to be able to achieve the one thing. So there could be multiple pathways, perhaps, that Simon and Tegan and Hanin could take to get them to the end product in their own way and own time. Of course, teaching approaches is just linked with the pedagogical practices that we talked about. So the fact that you're going to use different pedagogical practices or teaching approaches to engage with each of those different students. So they could all be working on comprehension skills. They could all be working on the fact that they need to infer, but Simon would be doing it in a reciprocal reading group, whereas Tegan would be doing it in a guided reading setting. You need to think about your routines and procedures and think about how you go about things in the classroom and how it could be adjusted to meet the needs of the different students. Flexible grouping is very important. So depending on what the point of need is, you could talk about the fact that Simon could be included into a group where he is with students of a similar calibre, so that they can get to that high level of discussion, which they might not be able to achieve with other students around. So with Simon, I would put him in a group where he could excel. With flexible grouping, you think about someone like a Tegan. We're not always talking about grouping like-minded or academically the same students in a group. You might suggest that for Tegan, she works with a Simon, or perhaps with someone in a middle ground to help build up her confidence and build up her knowledge set. So flexible grouping could be just grouping in lots of different ways to meet the needs of the kids at that particular time. You could make a suggestion of modifying tasks. So obviously that's the main thing with differentiation, is that we have modified tasks so that not everybody is completing the same task. And I think that kind of links really well with multiple pathways, and that you've got multiple ways for them to achieve what the learning intention is for the lesson. Feedback is a really good way of getting inclusive feedback, I suppose, to the teacher, because if you ask someone like a Tegan to perhaps go off and try a task, if you get feedback from her, or if you touch base with her at some point in the lesson, then you can suggest that you're going to get information back from her about how she's progressing, and you could perhaps modify or change depending on what the feedback is. I guess that kind of links here to what I put about roaming. Perhaps a teacher could roam around to get information about how each of the kids are travelling during the lesson. Of course, you could use modelling, because that's a great way to make sure that everyone's included and understands what it is, because the teacher is really specific and really explicit about what they want the students to do. And in that mini lesson, or the modelling at the beginning of the lesson, the teacher sets the expectations of the tasks and shows exactly how it's going to be done, so that the students can therefore go off and do it by themselves. You could suggest a vary of speed or delivery, so perhaps it's something different about how the lesson is structured. And the other suggestion was to use data to inform your teaching. So if you're being inclusive, you should be able to have some sort of data at the beginning that you're using to inform your teaching before you start a new lesson or new unit. So perhaps you could suggest that as well. These are just general suggestions on inclusive methods. So you'd have to think about how they relate to your two students and be a little bit more specific about that. Okay, so the next one is pretty much the same sort of question, except that this time it links to assessment. So we're talking about how you can ensure that your assessment is inclusive of all of the needs of everybody in the grade, but in particular Simon, Hanin and Tegan. So I guess it sort of all connects back to what their needs are in the beginning. So if we know that Simon is highly intelligent and we know that he's capable of working at a grade 6 level, we need to have assessment that is going to inform us about how much he does know and what he can do, and give us information based at his level. So what I've said here is, well, we definitely don't want a decoding test, because that's not going to give us any information about Simon. For him, I'd be looking at probably a lot of perhaps formative assessment and perhaps self-assessment, because that would give you a lot of information about where he's at with his learning, because he would be able to articulate, he would be able to articulate his own learning goals and reflect on his own learning goals, and someone who's quite articulate and understands the process of learning would be able to tell you quite specifically where they were at with their learning goals. Having those sorts of group discussions where Simon would be, say, in a reciprocal reading group, discussing text and telling you, I think that character did that because he was, he didn't like this character. So all of those discussions and all of that sort of formative assessment that you'd gather on Simon would really tell you a lot about what he's able to do in the classroom. So I think those sorts of things would suit Simon best and would be inclusive to his particular needs. You could throw in perhaps some more standardized testing like a probe. You just got to make sure that the tests go up to the required grade level. So we don't want just a stock standard grade 4 test that doesn't test anything beyond that, because that's not going to tell you anything that you need to know about Simon. So you could use a probe, for example, because that goes up to age 14, and that would give you information about how well Simon was progressing with his comprehension. And in the middle here, I'd like to see her doing lots of conferencing, because I think lots of chatting and lots of talking is going to give you a lot of information about where Hanin is with her learning. I'd like to see lots of multiple forms of assessment being used. I don't think it would be fair to Henin to just have a probe or just have a torch or just have something, especially when some of those standardized testings can be quite culturally specific. So there could be a story about a boy playing cricket in the backyard, and if that doesn't make any sense to her, then we don't want to, I mean, obviously for any child, we don't want to limit it to just one assessment, but particularly in this case, we want to have multiple forms of assessment, gathering lots of information. You'd want to have things, you know, perhaps formative assessment, which assessed her ability to, you know, question and conference in different group sort of settings. With Tegan, you're probably looking maybe for a bit more of formative assessment as well. I'm not sure Tegan would be a big fan of some of the more sort of standardized testing and could be perhaps put off by that. So you might want to suggest maybe some formative assessment as well that's a little bit more, I suppose, less threatening to her and would be gathered slowly over time. So you could build up a bit of a picture about what Tegan could do. Multiple types of assessment and conferencing again would be a big focus for her, and of course the focus is going to be on comprehension, as we well know. So there could be some ideas. I'm sure there's a lot of other ideas out there that have things, assessment that would help be inclusive of their needs. So we also need to write, now that we've established lots of information about these three students, so now we need to write some goals. Now, remembering again that we only choose 2 out of the 3 students, we don't need to do them all. So you need to write 2 learning goals for each of the students. Now, I know I've only got 1 for Henin, but I'm sure that you can go off and think of much, much more. They're just examples. So my thinking was with Simon, oh, sorry, I'll get to Simon in a minute. My thinking was with Henin that I'm thinking of exposure. That's always the thing that I keep coming back to with her. I think the more we can expose her to, the more she's going to understand of the world and the language and how it looks in different places and how it is structured in different genres and how it looks in different places and how it sounds. So I'd like to see her reading lots and lots of different kinds of texts. So with independent reading, a lot of the state government pushes now is to have 7 books in your book box and to have them of multiple genres. And that's with every student. So I'd like to see her reading goal be, I will read a variety of texts such as novels, magazines, comics, non-fiction. Maybe you could make her a little card and she could tick off that she's been reading lots and lots of different types of texts from lots of different sources to expose her to lots of different concepts, widen up her knowledge a little bit. With Tegan, she really needs to work on her comprehension skills, so I'd like to see her goals be centered around the fact that that's what she needs to work on. My idea was that she could perhaps use evidence from the text to help support her answers, because she seems to be giving answers and not looking back in the text to make connections to see if they're right. So when you use reorganization in a text, you're looking for clues in multiple points of the text. So she needs to be able to even highlight different sections of the text and use the answers to form her opinion, which leads into the second goal. So the first one was, I will use evidence from the text to support my answers, and I will form an opinion and give reasons why I think that way, and I'll use evidence from the text. So you say, I think Johnny didn't like Bob, this is why, and you give evidence from the text. With Simon, I use the curriculum. That's another tip that I'm going to do and give to you, is that you use the curriculum. I'm going to show you a little bit in a second of where you can get these things from, but we want Simon to be able to use a lot of those really higher order thinking skills now, that he can comprehend, he can read really well, he can justify ideas. He needs to move beyond that now, and he can say he can understand the difference between objective and subjective language, and he can identify bias in the text and discuss the author's intent. I have pulled these out, and excuse me while I just minimize my presentation for a sec. I have pulled these out of this. So in the other flipped collab, I talked about this as well. So the scope and sequence, this is just for language. So there is also literacy and literature, but it shows you the development of skills. So use that. All I've done is taken these outcomes from grade 6. Here's the one that I used which is the language outcome. So this shows the types of things that Simon needs to work towards. So you can give him a learning goal based on the curriculum. So use the scope and sequence to help you establish, or use the curriculum guidelines, use the curriculum content descriptors to help you form what his goals will be. Let me just get that back up again. I just wanted to show you that real quick. Okay, so I've taken those out of the grade 6 content descriptors and I've formed them into a learning goal for him, and something that I think is challenging and something that's going to give a bit of academic rigor to what he needs to do to continue to push him on. Lots of those high-flying students always get left behind because they're not pushed to continue that kind of growth that they've been achieving. So that's what we need to focus on with his learning goals. Okay, so just skipping up to this last one. So it says in point 7 that we need to make connections to curriculum wherever relevant. So obviously it makes sense with the goals in particular to make connections to curriculum there, because you can use the curriculum content descriptors to help you form what your goals are. Perhaps with assessment and pedagogical practices, you might find a link into. I'm going to have a little bit more think about this. Like I said, these assessments are new to us too, so I'm going to have a little reflect about how we can use the curriculum to support us in different areas. So we'll have a chat about that in our interactive Collaborate as well. I haven't included any slides to do with the rubric in particular, because I think that the 7 questions that they have in the assessment details pretty much covers what you need to cover anyway. Thank you. That's the end of our presentation. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the interactive collab. Thanks, everybody.